A Boeing 727 used to transport fuel to diamond mines vanishes after an unexpected departure from one of Angola's largest airports. Some say it was stolen, some think it was drug smugglers, some say it must have been warlords. Others, however, suspect it was the aircraft's previous owners. How can such a jetliner just vanish into thin air? Why would someone go as far as to steal a plane of that type? Was it even stolen, or was it repossessed? Were the owners acting on illicit intent, or were they merely victims of a third party? I, Detective Hudson, plan to answer all of the questions and a whole lot more about the fate of the 727 in question. The year was 1975, as the skies began to fill with the roar of jet-powered flying machines. An aircraft christened as November 844 Alpha Alpha was born and raised by American Airlines. Just like their flight crews, American ran it into the ground for nearly a quarter of a century, and yet it was in pristine condition, as if it was fresh out of the oven from the Boeing bakery. In the early 2000s, American then decided to retire the old workhorse, 3 of which were sold to Miami-based Aerospace Sales and Leasing Incorporated. One of their planes was sold to and then later repossessed from Air Angola after it became unable to afford the lease payments. The company itself is as hidden as the owner when he's questioned. Aerospace Sales and Leasing Incorporated was run by Mary Joseph, who acted as the president. Joseph was the type of entrepreneur that you can only find on Craigslist. During the 1990s, Joseph was the CEO of Florida West Air Cargo, a local air cargo company that surely went bankrupt after its launch. During that time, he was charged by the Securities and Exchange Commission in a civil case of falsifying financial statements and defrauding investors. The court imposed a fine and barred Joseph from acting as an officer in a publicly held company. Despite his politician-like ethics, one of the 727s had a prospective buyer, a South African entrepreneur christened as Keith Irwin. Irwin ran a series of IT companies and a small tourist airline that flew flights between South Africa and Mozambique until the year 2000. The successful but in-over-his-head hotshot represented a joint venture with South African-based Cargo Air Transport Systems. The company had signed a contract to supply fuel to diamond mines in the war-torn realm of chaos known as Angola. While Angola certainly is a lovely country and it's not the most dangerous in the world, it certainly had better days. The country at the time was rattled in a civil war that made transporting goods on the ground as safe as eating gas station sushi. The aircraft was refitted to carry fuel tanks and flown by 2 flight crews. One of the flight crews consisted of 2 men in particular. The first was Ben C. Padilla, a Florida man who was a certified flight engineer, aircraft mechanic, and a pilot of small airplanes. You might think a man like Padilla would be an asset for a flight crew. However, according to his records, the only company that would accept him would be none other than Air Peace. Not only did he lack the qualifications and training to fly larger jet aircraft, he also equally lacked the ethics of a good employee. In the 1990s, he worked as a flight engineer for an Indonesian-based airline ran by Florida businessman Jeff Swain. Swain was not exactly on Padilla's list of references. According to Swain, he was too involved in chasing the local girls. It was an unstructured environment, and he just went bad. Once he was on the ropes, we finally had him deported. According to Swain, Padilla had stayed in the hotel in Indonesia for about 2 months and racked up a $10,000 bill that he claimed the airline would pay. The other man was John M. Mutantu, a mechanic from the Republic of the Congo. He's as mysterious as the Bermuda Triangle. There's little that's known about him. Other than that, his name is John, he's a mechanic, and he's from the Congo. The venture was backed by a single investor. The deal consisted of a $450,000 deposit, with Irwin managing the flight operations. Joseph sold 844 Alpha Alpha to Irwin for $1 million in change. And according to his records, he received a down payment of $125,000, and he says that he stipulated that the balance be paid within 30 days. He agreed to remove the passenger seats from the aircraft cabin and to allow Irwin to take the airliner to Africa. Irwin says he can't remember all the details, although he did remember it to be a lease arrangement. However, the deal went about as smooth as a cheap rum and Everclear cocktail served with broken glass. The investor backed out of the deal, and the joint venture made only 2 payments, then defaulted. Irwin ended up with fuel tanks and no airplane. That failure, as a result, stranded 6 crewmen who had assembled in Miami. According to Irwin, the guys were then desperate for work. Most of those guys had not flown in a long time because of the 9/11 story. I said, look, I can take you on if we can find another aircraft. Irwin then found a new investor, and on February 28th of 2002, with most of the passenger seats removed and the 10 fuel tanks loaded, the 727, still in the livery of American Airlines with a blue stripe down the side and an AA logo fading on its tail, took off for Africa. However, to add more speed bumps to this already dysfunctional deal, Irwin's partners hadn't arranged a landing permit, and as a result, it took them 2 weeks to arrive at the Quattro de Feverer International Airport. Irwin at some point must have uttered the forbidden phrase, "Can this day get any worse?" The deal went from a venture enterprise to an Old Testament-style punishment. Irwin soon began to realize, however, that the previous issues were a mere slice of cake compared to what was waiting for him and the crew. To start off, the company hiring his partners for the deliveries, Kawachi Dundo, was supposed to pay $220,000 when the airplane and crew landed, but instead the company's representative made excuses. In other words, Irwin's choice of business partners is about as wise as trusting an honest politician. The conditions for the crew made North Korean labor camps look cozy in comparison. The crew endured accommodations in a dismal apartment without electricity, drinkable water, or anything else. In fact, it was right near an open sewer. Irwin and the crew had never spent any time or done any business in Angola. The only man not troubled by the circumstances was Mike Gabriel, a dealer in aircraft parts and engines. He had spent a considerable amount of time in West Africa and was accustomed to the AK-47s the men saw everywhere, including stacked up behind the bar of a club they frequented. To add to the anxiety, the crew were required to surrender their passports on arrival. Irwin explains that Kawachi needed the passports to obtain Angolan licenses for the pilots to fly and for the flight engineers. Kawachi then got wind of unrest amongst the crew. Allegedly, multiple crew members had conspired to take the aircraft and fly it back to the States. Because of this, the company refused to return the passports. It took Irwin and the crew members visiting a U.S. embassy to have the passports returned. Art Powell, one of the flight engineers with the project, said, I was scared to death. I really thought I was going to die. Powell had been to Angola, and in the past had also spent a year working in Nairobi, Kenya. But this experience was different. He felt intimidated by the people who had hired the crew for their fuel delivery job. Powell grew fearful and restless, being in the presence of a local helper who touted an AK-47. The helper was a guard whom Mike Gabriel says he hired because the crew reportedly voiced concerns about safety. Another crewman who spoke under the condition of anonymity had this to say.
It's the most dangerous flying in the world. I've been a flight deck crew member for 30 years. For me, it was an opportunity to make a couple of bucks. And when everything started falling apart, I probably hung on twice as long as common sense dictated. But I had too much invested at that point to bail out.
As a U.S. Air Force veteran, he likened the deliveries to flying into a war zone. When they approached the airfields, the crew tried to stay at an altitude above small arms fire for as long as possible, then would spiral down to land. According to Mike Gabriel, many of the runways aren't paved and maintained like one's U.S. and European crews are accustomed to. On some, you land uphill, then go downhill, then uphill again. According to the anonymous crewman, just before the aircraft arrived at one airstrip, a different 727 flying for a competing company crash-landed and skidded off the runway, and although the crew survived, according to him, some of the local residents were killed.
We gave the other flight crew a lift out of there, but not before going over to their airplane and stealing some parts that we needed. That's when I decided that it was time to go home.
But that, of course, wasn't all.
A big African showed up with a briefcase full of $100 bills. It was payday.
Besides, of course, paying the crew, the money was supposed to pay off accumulated airport fees and fuel costs.
After that, I created a family emergency. I said my mother is sick. I had no intentions of going back, of course. I didn't get anywhere near full pay, but I got enough that I could pay my bills and make it not completely worthless.
By the end of April, all of the Americans except Mike Gabriel had left. The circumstances only continued to make Irwin question why he even joined the deal to begin with. But things only began to descend into hell even more rapidly. Irwin hired a local crew and continued to deliver fuel to the mines, but he himself was ready to leave too. After a while, the civil war in Angola had ended, and while that was good news for the country, the fuel hauling market began to take a dive as a result. Competition amongst fuel pigeons had intensified. Irwin's partners were claiming part ownership of the aircraft, but unsurprisingly, just like his partners had done in the past, they hadn't paid Murray Joseph, nor did he have any record of them doing so or even attempting to do so. Meanwhile, Joseph sent a crew to swap an engine from the 727. Irwin grew increasingly unsettled with the delivery deals. At one point, he was being followed by a local man named Antonio, who Irwin believes was working for one of his partners. I would turn around and spot Antonio watching me from a car. One night, he heard a key card slide into the slot on his door, and the lock released. Irwin, however, began wedging a chair underneath the door handle of his hotel room. Just like you would see in the movies. I started yelling, and whoever it was ran. The hotel security guards questioned the night clerk, and it was discovered that he had accepted a bribe to provide the key card for his room. At this point, fearing for his safety and having nothing to gain from the deal, Irwin left the country the next day and didn't go back. He then extricated himself from the deal. Murray Joseph then fired Mike Gabriel sometime that spring after no word on the outstanding balance that he owed on the airplane. He kept convincing me that next month, I'd get the money. In May 2002, the only part of the original project left at the Luanda airport was 844 Alpha Alpha. However, Joseph and the other investors were soon about to learn that they were going to get way more than they bargained for.
The FAA has issued an airplane abduction alert. The aircraft is a silver Boeing 727 registered November 844 Alpha Alpha. She was last seen at the Luanda airport with two unknown males at 5 p.m.
In November of 2002, Joseph and Padilla flew to Nigeria to deliver a 727. Joseph hired Padilla to fly to Angola the following April to pay the outstanding fines and hire mechanics to return the 727 to service. If the company that contracted for fuel deliveries wasn't paying Mr. Irwin, you can assume he wasn't paying anybody. He probably hadn't paid the fuel bill. He didn't pay the navigation fees, the landing fees, and certainly wasn't paying the parking fees at the airport. So, all of those became things that we had to resolve, and I had to pay all those. Padilla worked with Air Gemini, a Luanda-based airline that operated a repair station. According to Joseph, the return-to-service process was progressing steadily, and in May of 2003, acting as Joseph's agent, Padilla hired a pilot and a co-pilot from Air Gemini to help him deliver the aircraft to Johannesburg in South Africa, where Joseph was waiting with his new customer. A day or two before the aircraft was to leave Luanda, Padilla made plans with Air Gemini to take the aircraft from the company hangar out to the main runway, where he intended to run the three engines up to full power for a systems check. The next morning, however, on May 26th, when Joseph and Swain were expecting 844 Alpha Alpha to land, Joseph got a call from an Air Gemini employee who demanded to know why another crew had flown the airplane out of Luanda. This came as a shock to Joseph, as he wasn't made aware of a crew change, and he was expecting the plane to be in South Africa. But the plane never arrived. After the shock wore off, he He telephoned the U.S. Embassy in South Africa to report the disappearance. Then he called his wife back in Florida to tell her to call the FBI. From Washington, D.C., the Department of State, notified by the U.S. Embassy in Angola, sent a message to every American embassy in Africa. The message read, "Alert aviation officials that an airliner has been stolen, and call every airport with a runway long enough to handle a 727. An investigation was subsequently launched. On May 25th of 2003, as the sun was setting, 844 Alpha Alpha, after sitting idle for over a year and incurring $4 million in unpaid airport fees, the two men whose identities remain unknown boarded the aircraft. The engines were started and, without clearance from the tower, began to taxi. With no lights or transponder, the 727 began rushing toward the runway and took off, heading southwest towards the Atlantic Ocean. 844 Alpha Alpha, along with Ben Padilla and John Matantu, were never seen again. In July 2003, a sighting of the missing aircraft was reported in Guinea, but was conclusively dismissed by the U.S. State Department. So, a Boeing 727 gets plane napped with two unknown individuals in Angola. The obvious question: who was responsible? There are two theories. The first, mostly accepted by the U.S. government, is that the aircraft theft was staged as a part of an insurance fraud scheme. General Robeson of the U.S. Marine Corps had this to say: "Part of the intelligence was that the airplane was in a bad state of repair. That was one of the speculations, that it was an insurance fraud situation. You know, oops, my plane was hijacked/stolen by terrorists, and now I can do an insurance claim on it. So that was probably as valid of an explanation when all was said and done as anything, but we just left it as an unknown." Given Murray Joseph's questionable track record as a businessman and Ben Padilla's record as an employee, the financial struggles and the shady behavior of Irwin's business partners, it stands to reason that Joseph and Padilla were in some way involved of staging the plane napping to create some kind of insurance claim. However, it is worth noting that neither Padilla nor Mutantu were ever confirmed to be on the aircraft on the night of the disappearance. Some airport officials claim it was the two men, however, others claim that it was two unknown men. Some have also claimed that there was a third unknown individual who boarded the aircraft with them. This leads us to the second theory. A nefarious group stole the aircraft and planned on using it for illicit purposes. At the time, terrorism was the first cause for concern. Not only was this nearly 2 years after 9/11, but Angola had just crawled out of a civil war. In fact, just 2 years prior was the infamous August 10, 2001 Angola train attack. A passenger train traveling between the towns of Zenza and Dondo was derailed with an anti-tank mine and then shot at with small arms fire, killing nearly 300 people and injuring nearly 200. Even today, there's an ongoing conflict between the Front for the Liberation of the Enclave of Cambedda, or FLEC, and the Angolan military. In short, there were motivations and plenty of groups that would be willing to use the aircraft for terrorism. But since the disappearance, there haven't been any terror attacks involving the aircraft or any airliner of that type, and there haven't been any terror groups that have claimed responsibility for the plane napping. This leads to the other possibility of criminal enterprise. Groups such as the Mexican cartel are known to use small aircraft to transport drugs or weapons. The planes often fly low to avoid radar detection and fly into wooded areas or makeshift airfields. While Angola isn't the most dangerous country in the world, it's far from perfect. The country is a notorious transit point for poachers and animal traffickers. Law enforcement tends to lack sufficient resources to deal with organized crime and in some cases benefit directly from that crime. The 727 would certainly be the ideal aircraft to carry heavier loads of God knows what and fly farther distances. However, as of now, no trace of the aircraft has been found. Padilla and Mutantu remain missing. No one has been arrested in connection with the plane napping, and most of the workers involved have either gone their separate ways or have simply remained silent. Part of what makes this case tricky is the lack of credible information. Little is known about the companies involved. Some have either been disbanded, bought out, or simply just faded into history. What are your thoughts on the Vanishing? Do you think a nefarious group took the two men against their will, or does Murray Joseph know more than he's letting on?